Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I am Cassidy Campbell, and I manage the solid waste program at the North Central Texas Council of Governments. Today's webinar will cover the process for applying for one of our solid waste grants for the FY 2020 through 2021 biennium. We will have time for questions at the end of this webinar. Please feel free to submit any questions in the chat box at the bottom of your screen during the webinar. Today, I'm going to kick everything off with a very brief overview of our solid waste program. COG receives grant funding from the TCEQ in order to administer the solid waste program in our 16-county North Central Texas region. Solid Waste Advisory Committee, the Resource Conservation Council, directs the funding and provides guidance and support to the program. Solid waste grants for local and regional projects are available every 2 years as funding allows. This slide is a compilation of what I perceive to be the most useful resources for you during the grant application process. The first bullet here indicates our solid waste grant website, and this includes kind of a history of the program. We also have past grantees, past awardees that you can review, and we also have current application requirements and all of the other documentation and guidelines and the project timeline will be included here on this website. The second bullet is for our grant application guidelines document. This is probably going to be the most critical document that you use for the grant application process. So I recommend that you get as familiar with it as possible, because this is a much more in-depth guidance document for you than what I'll be able to cover here in the webinar. And it includes all the requirements and information that will be necessary in order to execute your grant application and your grant properly, and to make sure that you don't get disqualified for any reason. The call for projects timeline is the third bullet here, and I've linked it, even though I actually am going to be discussing this in the next slide. But that is so that you have all of the really critical resources together gathered on this one slide. And then last is my contact information, because I hope to be a resource to everyone as well. I'm thrilled to answer any questions or help with any concerns or confusion. So please feel free to call me or email me or both, so that I can help walk you through anything, or if you want to bounce ideas off of me, I'm very happy to help as much as I can. So as I mentioned, here's what our intended call for projects timeline will look like. It's possible that we could end up with some unforeseen circumstances that cause us to have some delays, but generally speaking, we plan to stick to this timeline as closely as feasible. A couple of highlights that I want to point out: call for projects will open on October 14th, 2019, and the call for projects will close on January 6th, 2020. This means that all grant applications need to be final and submitted through our online portal no later than close of business January 6th. Anticipate that the scoring process will take place in January 2020. That might actually bleed over into the very beginning, but we're aiming for January. The RCC, our Solid Waste Advisory Committee, will be approving the subcommittee's recommendations in February. That meeting date has not been finalized yet, but we're aiming for February. We then plan to take these RCC project recommendations to the COG Executive Board on March 26, 2020, in order to execute interlocal agreements and provide notice to proceed in April 2020, which will allow our awardees approximately a year to administer their grants. And eligibility. We have approximately $1.1 million in funds available for this biennium's call for projects, and eligible applicants include cities, counties, public and independent school districts. This does, however, exclude universities and other post-secondary educational institutions, and general and special law districts, and councils of governments. Private sector entities and nonprofit organizations are not eligible for direct funding, but they may receive project funding if they are contracted with an eligible entity in order to provide specific project funded services. Keep in mind that all funding recipients must adhere to all local government laws and regulations on bidding and contracting for services. There are two different project types. The first one is the local government project, which includes applications with 1 or 2 eligible applicants. This type of project includes a minimum funding request of $15,000 with a maximum request of $200,000. The second project type is the regional collaborative project. This includes applications with at least 3 eligible applicants. The minimum funding request for this project type is $125,000 with a maximum request of $500,000. The following project categories are eligible for these grant funds: local enforcement, source reduction and recycling, household hazardous waste, litter and illegal dumping programs, collection stations and small transfer stations, local solid waste management plans, technical studies with a regional scope or impact, and educational and training projects. Eligible expense categories include equipment, construction, contractual, and other. For those of you who have applied for grants before, you may notice that the supply category and the personnel category are no longer included. However, if you do need staff for your project, you can contract that out. That is still eligible under contractual. Keep in mind that each line item must meet or exceed $500 to be considered eligible. This doesn't mean that you have to purchase, that each individual purchase has to equal $500 or more, but you just need to purchase enough in number to be able to exceed that amount. So for example, if you want to purchase flyers for an educational project, you just need to purchase enough flyers so that that line item equals or exceeds $500. Again, details can be found in the grant application guidelines on a little bit more context and details on expense categories and the line item requirements, et cetera, et cetera. The application process. Applications for the call for projects must be received in the web-based application system by 5 o'clock Central Standard Time on January 6, 2020. No faxed, emailed, or hard copy applications will be accepted. Applicants will be required to register in the system with a username and password. We strongly recommend that you try to register prior to the application deadline in order to avoid delays caused by any technical difficulties. That will give us enough of time to troubleshoot any issues that we have before that deadline. Here is the application checklist. All of these items are required for the application to be considered complete. Several of these items I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on in the following slides, but I wanted to point out, if you'll notice, there is a bullet at the bottom that is in bold. The signed resolution or court order is actually required within 30 days of the application close date. So if that item is ready and available by January 6th, feel free to go ahead and submit it. Otherwise, you have 30 days from the day of closure in order to get that submitted. That's just to allow people for more time to be able to make it to council and get whatever resolution or court order they are required to do. And also, I wanted that additional supporting documentation is highly encouraged. This includes maps, drawings, plans, photos, quotes, anything that you can think of that will paint a more detailed picture for our scoring subcommittee, because it really helps them in their decision-making process, because it helps clarify and kind of bring their grant application together in a manner that gives them a much better idea of what you intend to do with those funds. An applicant meeting with COG is now required for everybody who intends to apply for a grant. This used to be a requirement just for people that were new to a COG grant, but now we are requiring it for everyone. The applicant will need to submit the grant application document to me, my email address that's included here in the slide, and schedule either an in-person meeting or a conference call. The deadline for scheduling this meeting is November 15th, 2019. It doesn't mean that the meeting has to take place before November 15th, but it does need, the request for scheduling needs to be submitted by November 15th. Grant applications will not be eligible for funding if this meeting or call with COG has not occurred. Risk assessment requirements. This is a new item. It will now be required for everybody. Every applicant will need to complete the COG risk assessment. The first part of this will be a subrecipient pre-award risk assessment questionnaire. This document has not been finalized yet, but a draft of the questionnaire has been posted to our website so that everyone can review and become familiar with the types of questions and information and documentation that will be requested throughout this process. And the purpose of this pre-award risk assessment questionnaire is to determine level of risk. So there might be some further steps after that, depending on what our risk assessment team ends up determining regarding the level of risks of funding certain entities. It's important to note that entities that have completed this risk assessment process within a certain time frame will not need to complete it again. So for example, if your entity applied for a grant through the COG's transportation department 3 months ago, they won't need to complete the risk assessment process again because it's already been documented. The timeline for this, when I say a certain time frame, is rolling calendar year. And so I don't have exact information yet on who will be exempt from this process and who won't be, simply because I don't know when our risk assessments will be taking place, even though we are aiming for the January or February timeframe. So what we intend to do is put a list of entities that will definitely be exempt because they will for sure be within that rolling calendar year, and then also potentially exempt entities that will be posted on our website as well, so that it will be easier for you to check in and see whether or not you will be exempt or not, without getting upset with me for giving you incorrect information. Sector notification. The grant-funded project may not be otherwise readily available or create a competitive advantage over a private industry that provides recycling. Failure to notify private sector service providers will result in immediate disqualification of the grant application. The categories that require notification are source reduction and recycling, citizens collection stations and small register transfer stations, a demonstration project under the educational and training projects category. What you must do is contact the private sector entities which are providing similar services within the same geographical area for which grant funds are being requested. A list of service providers within our region can be found at timetorecycle.com in the link included in this slide. Please note that private sector notification must be documented in the grant application. All applications will be reviewed by the RCC's Grant Selection Subcommittee in January or February 2020. All applicants will be required to provide a presentation to the subcommittee, and applicants will be notified of after the call for projects closes on January 6th, 2020. I'm hoping to be able to notify applicants of the dates. There will be 2 days that are selected in January or February during which the selection subcommittee will meet. And so I'm hoping to be able to provide those dates much in advance of the January 6th deadline for the call for projects. However, I won't know times until I know everybody who's applied. So stay tuned for more information and details on that. Evaluation criteria. All applicants will be evaluated based on the following criteria for a total of 100 points. Now, this is another area where I highly recommend that you reference the grant application guidelines, because the point distributions are different depending on the type of project you apply for. If you're doing a local government project, it will look a little bit different than if you're doing a regional collaborative project. But the items that are going to be evaluated are budget, timeline, description and demonstration of funding need, project impacts and benefits, regional advancement of materials management and project sustainability, and partnerships and regional impacts. This is regional collaborative projects only. Each applicant must identify a minimum of one of the applicable goals and objectives from the Planning for Sustainable Materials Management in North Central Texas that the applicant's project intends to address. Applicants must also provide COG with a list of the last 4 solid waste projects they have been awarded by COG and the total budget for each of these projects. Please note, this is also new. All applicants will need to include information in the grant application indicating that the following items have been evaluated: the ongoing maintenance costs of grant-funded equipment and whether or not that fits in your entity's budget, of whether or not additional equipment will be needed in order to utilize grant-funded items. For example, if you're applying for a trailer, will you also need a tractor to be able to pull the trailer? And any special licensing or training needs. For example, are you going to need to train your staff how to utilize your forklift that you're requesting for, or do you already have people on staff capable of doing that? And then also considerations regarding vehicles that require special driver's license or anything of that nature. Applicant appeals. Applicants may appeal the funding recommendations to the RCC. However, these appeals must be based on a specific identified error of the grant scoring subcommittee and not on factors that allow for discretion. The deadline to appeal is 5:00 p.m. on March 30th, 2020. Applicants must submit the appeal to COG in writing, and that can be via email or letter. Okay, so now I've actually covered the bulk of what you probably need to know, at least at a high level, for the grant application process, but I thought it would be helpful for you to be able to evaluate our solid waste grant requirements to see whether or not you wanted to apply for a grant. So these next few slides, even though they're not directly applicable to the application process, it can help you in your evaluation on whether or not this is something that you actually want to apply for. So the solid waste grant requirements include these following bullets, and that is successful applicants will be required to enter into a standard interlocal agreement with COG. It's important to note that project funding will be provided on a reimbursement basis only. This means that COG will not ever, under any circumstances, provide funding in advance. Subrecipients must be willing to allow COG and or the TCEQ to perform on-site visits to monitor the progress of the projects. And subrecipients must agree to provide reporting related to the results of the project to COG. The reimbursement of expenses include a signed reimbursement request form. This template will be provided by COG, a purchase order, an invoice, and proof of payment. Proof of payment either includes a canceled check or a credit card statement along with a bank statement showing that that credit card statement has been paid. A credit card statement in and of itself is not sufficient proof of payment. Reporting requirements. There are quarterly progress reports that are required that all recipients must submit, detailing progress toward project completion on a quarterly basis until final reimbursement is issued. A template will be provided by COG for all of these reporting requirements. The second reporting requirement is a results report that grant recipients will submit from the start of the project to August 31st, 2020. So this is essentially a cumulative results report. And as I mentioned, a template will be provided by COG. Then there is the later results report, in which grant recipients will be required to submit a report documenting results 1 year after the project completion date. And again, a template will be provided by COG. So that covers everything that I am going to be briefing everybody on today. So now we will open it up for questions. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to type the ones that you have into the chat box. We received a question saying, are there any examples of smaller cities who started up recycling programs? There aren't any that I'm immediately aware of. I can dig into that a little bit more and see if I can find an answer for that and post that on our website as well. And then we received a question saying, if multiple cities are going to apply, does each city have to fill requirements? Yes. I might not be understanding this question, but if multiple cities are going to apply, and the question is about eligibility, yes, they all need to be eligible to apply. And if the question is related to risk assessment, that's a really good question that I would have to revert back to our risk assessment team And then also there are different circumstances. Cities are eligible to apply for our grant funds. And so even if you're considering doing a regional collaborative project, but usually when we have a regional collaborative project, one city takes the lead and the rest of them provide support. And so we would really have one person within that city that's applying as the point of contact. And so they would be the one filling out the grant. We don't need to have like 3 separate applications. So I hope I'm answering that question. I know I kind of went off on several different branches there. We received a question saying, are there examples of previous projects somewhere online? Yes, there are examples of previous projects that were funded on our grant application website. And that included in the resources slide, the very top bullet. Another question saying, you said the grant would not fund a salaried position, correct? It would need to be on a contracted basis. Yes, that is correct. Our grant funds do not fund salaried personnel, but we can do contracted staff. Another question saying, for regional planning, do all cities need to take the risk assessment? That's actually an excellent question. I would need to double check with our assessment team to see exactly how that works. I think that there's a strong possibility that only the lead city would need to take the risk assessment, but I don't want to make any promises because I'm definitely not an expert on those types of rules and requirements and making sure that we meet federal and state rules and regulations. But what we will do too is post these questions and the responses online as well so that people are able to review those. Well, like those are the only questions that we have received. So we will go ahead and close out the webinar. Again, this webinar will be posted, the slides will be posted, and the questions and answers will be posted online on our grant, our implementation grant website. If anybody has any questions that come to them at any point, please feel free to email them to me. My contact information is here on this slide. Or call me with questions and we can get those posted as well. So thank you again to everyone who joined us today. We hope that this presentation was helpful and this webinar is now over.